Okay, I think we're started. Oh yeah, by the way, feel free to cuss as much as you fucking want. There's no way in hell this show's getting monetized, so you can drop as many F-bombs or cuss words as you want.
Good to know
This,
because I have to kind of hold back a lot of times on my show and on
no, no,
DA's
not
show.
my show. This is a rated R show, my friend. Anyway, for a low R, not a high R. No NC-17.
So we're
Okay.
not Edge. We're
Yeah, we're like an 80s R-rated action movie levels of language
we're
here.
rated R superstar, huh?
Yeah. Um, yeah. Anyway, so folks, tonight I've got my buddy Robby Rains. I love your name, by the way. Alliteration to the name. I love it.
Everybody says that. Everybody says I have that one of those names that you just have to say the first and the last name. I don't get it, but whatever.
Yeah, man, it's a cool sounding name. You sound like a superhero, like alter identity.
Now I've never heard it put that way before. I think you're the first one that ever said that, Donnie. But thank you. I
Yeah, his
appreciate
secret
that.
identity. He's like,
Yeah.
I'm Robby Rains, and you see like this big jack dude with all these powers. Anyway, tonight we are gathered here. Robbie's a friend of mine that I've met through the cryptid community. We met at the Dogman conference. We got to hang out with Tex and all them, and Brandy and
Mm-hmm.
Krista. That was a good time.
Adam and Greg and all those guys. Yeah, we had a
Yeah,
good time.
yeah. Real quick before we start, did you want to mention anything about us all hanging out together that weekend as a group?
Yeah, I mean, we saw some very interesting uh things,
Yeah.
especially that first night out at the stockyard. Some things that uh I wasn't expecting to see in Texas.
We
I think
saw
me
some
and
of
you,
the sites that Texas had to offer.
yeah, I think me and you both talked about, and like the guy, not just this one, but the guy that stopped in the middle of the street to take pictures of the car. I think me and you
Oh
were talking
yeah,
about that. Like,
yeah,
is that a thing here in Texas? Just taking pictures of cars in the middle of the road, but and then the guys in the eccentric outfits.
yeah,
And I'm using
yeah.
that term very loosely. We actually saw some good artwork, though. I wasn't sure what Jason was on
Hmm.
about wanting us to go take our little uh, field trip to the art museum, but that was some pretty
Jason
cool art.
McLean is pretty obsessed with dinosaurs, which is kind of ironic coming from such a very Christian
And,
man.
and you know, I told him you should have led with the fact that it was dinosaurs, Jason, and I would have been more excited. But when you say we're going to an art museum, that's not exactly the thing that that I'm going to jump on and want to go to. But there again,
But then it was
it
dinosaurs
was
chasing
dinosaurs and
down
cowboys.
cowboys.
It
Yeah,
was cool. I
it
enjoyed it.
was.
So
Those paintings were like 11 grand each. I was like,
yeah,
geez, because I kind of wanted to buy one for Jason, but I saw the price tag. I was like, whoa.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But
What kind of
there were
person buys that? What do you think kind of person actually spends the 11 grand to buy a painting of a T-Rex chasing down a cowboy?
somebody
What
with
kind of
more
person?
money than sense. Same
Yeah,
kind of person who goes out and buys a Bugatti Veyron just
yeah.
here in the United States where you can't really even legally do what the
Like
thing's
no
supposed to do.
no insurance company in the world would want to touch it.
Yeah. You
Yeah,
gotta what? Nah, we ain't touching that.
yeah, yeah. What kind of asshole buys something like that? Like I would love to have it, but to spend like
Oh
over
yeah.
10 grand,
Yeah.
that's
I
like
mean,
that's like yeah, that's like drug dealer money.
yeah, well see, but there I guess the same thing kind of goes it depends on what you're into.
Yeah.
You and I are sitting talking. I wouldn't spend 11 grand on a painting. I mean, they're cool, and if I had 11 grand to spend, it wouldn't be on a painting. I would spend it on like maybe a gun or some kind
Like
of
if I were a billionaire, I'd buy it, right?
yeah.
Because to a billionaire, what's 11 grand?
But even so, if I was a billionaire, I probably wouldn't have any pieces of artwork in my house. I would have guns. I would have knives. I would have a big shop to have all kinds of tools. But that's
Mm,
me. That's the kind of person I am.
yeah, that's where
So
you and I differ.
I
Yeah.
guess it's all about because somebody might look at me and say, "Why did you spend $10,000 on a rifle?" Because I had to have it. It
Mm,
was cool. I so
yeah, I get it.
because there's some
Anyway,
guns out there that cost that much. So
one of the things I would do, and I'm going to tie this into our conversation for tonight. You know what I would do if I were a super billionaire? Number one, this is where I think you and I could agree. Personal chef.
Of course.
Personal professional chef. Of course.
Of
But then
course.
number two, the other thing I would get would be my own personal like MMA trainer. Like hire like Hickson Gracie to teach me Brazilian jiu-jitsu or something. Wouldn't you do that if you were like a billionaire?
Oh yeah. I don't know if I'd go with Hickson.
Yeah, he's kind of old now.
Yeah.
Who would you
Now,
get? Who would you pay to train you?
if I could pick anybody, and honestly, I would probably have to go with Yoda, Greg Jackson. I like his mentality. I like I mean, and the pedigree doesn't lie. He's trained some of the sport's best.
He's one of the best minds in the game.
And
Yeah.
that's why everybody calls him Yoda. I mean,
for those of you who don't know, Greg Jackson is one of the most legendary MMA fighting coaches there is in the sport, especially in the UFC. Like his gym produced a lot of champions.
Yeah, John Jones.
Oh,
I mean,
come on, man.
Who else do you need to go to after you say?
Come
I mean,
on.
but let's see. I think Cormier started there.
With Greg Jackson, really?
Yeah, I think he started there. I don't.
Oh, okay. Because I know he's an AKA.
Yeah, he is now.
Yeah.
But
that's another legendary. Jeez,
Yeah.
the freaking monsters that come out of AKA. Khabib,
Yeah.
come on, man. Although he was already probably ridiculous before even going in there.
Oh yeah.
We got to do a show just on Khabib. Just on Khabib.
Yeah, and I'm not a big fan of his because of his attitude, but as far as his body of work, that you can't deny how great the guy is.
Undeniable.
Yeah, it's. I mean, we've had that discussion about Fedor. You can argue on Fedor's greatness or not just because of where he was at and the talent that he was matched up against. Now, had he gone sooner to where some of the talent was and done better, maybe you wouldn't have had that argument. But I think he stayed and he got stagnant. And by the time he did move, that's why everything had passed him by. It's like the Ken Shamrock thing. You know, Shamrock stayed in the Lion's Den and was the top dog in the Lion's Den forever and thought he was untouchable because he could beat everybody's butt in the Lion's Den. And then
he gets
Tito times 3.
Tito Ortiz. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that first fight, he looked like he got shot in the face with a howitzer.
Yeah. I mean, he didn't really have too many high profile wins after that.
No, I don't.
He lost most of them.
Yeah. Maybe one.
After that, his career got a resurgence more so in pro wrestling than it did in MMA.
Yeah. Yeah. Because he went back to what, TNA or Impact?
No, he went back to the WWE. Oh, no. I mean, before. I mean, afterwards.
Yeah.
You're talking about afterwards. Yeah. No, I'm talking about like when he was in the WWE, Ken Shamrock was, right? This was during the Monday Night Wars, the Attitude. Man. Yeah, the world's most dangerous man. And he was like buddied up with like Steve Blackman. Remember that guy?
Steve Blackman, the Lethal Weapon.
Yeah. I love
that dude was legit, though.
I love that guy.
Yeah. There's plenty of stories of Al Snow and Bradshaw and Bob
he beat
Holly
the fuck out of Bradshaw and like JBL in an airport. He just like beat the shit out of him.
Yeah, they kept fucking with him, and he kept telling them, "Leave me alone." And Al Snow actually told this story too, and he said that Steve kept telling him, "Leave me alone, quit messing with me." They were just trying to rib him, which the boys do. And he beat the ever-loving shit out of both of them.
Beat the fuck out of that guy.
And just being able to do that to Bob Holly says something, because Bob Holly is a tough SOB. Steve Austin has said that Bob Holly is one of the toughest guys he's ever been in the ring with. And for Austin to give somebody those props.
I've heard Bob Holly was like one of those dudes you don't mess with in real life, which was so funny because his character was so like not that.
Especially that for his first generation, Sparky Plug.
Yeah.
But now once he went to hardcore Holly, that was
that was different.
That was the true Bob Holly.
Yeah.
But then Ron Simmons said that Bradshaw was probably one of the toughest guys he ever run with, and to run around with Ron Simmons, you had to be tough because Ron Simmons was legitimately tough too. They were just two big old tough raw bone football players that become professional wrestlers.
That's another topic we have to do. The toughest actual dudes in pro wrestling, which we will get to. Actually, again, ties to our topic.
Yep.
Because the topic of tonight, with my friend Robby here, we are going to be talking about two things, actually, right? Number one, the original UFC, the very first, I guess, official MMA event, which is arguable. But let's just say for the general masses, this is the first actual MMA event, okay?
The first
We're
big had a lot of
yeah,
money put into it.
yeah. We are going to talk about that, and then we are going to talk about the most influential, I would say, family in all of martial arts who had a huge hand in the formation of this first event, the Gracie family, and go into a bit of their history. So, let me explain to you a bit about my first memory of UFC, and then I'm going to ask you, Rob, if you tell me your first memory of UFC, okay?
Okay.
So the first UFC came out, I believe, in November of '93. I was 13 years old at the time. I'm 43 now. And I remember I never watched the first UFC. I remember being in the lunchroom cafeteria in the 8th grade, middle school. My buddy walks in, like comes charging in. He's like, guys, I saw the craziest shit last night on pay-per-view. And we're like, well, what was it? Now, keep in mind, as a kid at this point, I'm a huge fan of martial arts movies, right? I'm a huge fan of wrestling. I'm a huge Van Damme guy, right? So in my mind, who were the toughest motherfuckers out there? They were, in my opinion, at the time, it was Mike Tyson and Bruce Lee, right?
Yeah, that's two pretty good candidates. I don't know
Yeah,
that
especially like pre 93, especially if you're like this young Asian kid who grew up on all these martial arts films. You see Mike Tyson in his prime, right? Because that was like late 80s, early 90s. And you see him tear these dudes apart, and you're like, there ain't no way in hell anyone's fucking with this guy, right? And then, of course, Bruce Lee, because he's so legendary, right? Those were the people I thought. First UFC comes out, my buddy comes in, charging in. I remember this guy. His name was Mike. He had the most fabulous of mullets, and he had like Coke bottle glasses. And he comes in telling us, and at first I'm like, yo, they did Bloodsport, but for real life? Like he's like, yeah, they got all the champion martial artists from all over the world for a single elimination tournament. And of course, the question is, well, who won? Which martial art won? Surely, because he was like, they had a kung fu guy, karate guy, kickboxers. I'm like, holy shit. And then he was like, they had a sumo wrestler. And I was like, whoa, this is like Street Fighter 2. And then he tells me who won. And then he tells me, oh, yeah, it was like I guess he was like a Hispanic guy. He was like the smallest guy there. The guy looked like an accountant, and he just mopped up. And we're like, what do you mean he mopped up? I mean, this guy, like, just nobody could touch him. And he got everyone to tap, and he barely even threw a single punch the whole time. And no one had an answer. And it blew my mind. I couldn't believe it. And I was like, how do you win this kind of tournament with barely even throwing a punch? Until I had to finally see for myself. And then I watched UFC 2. And after seeing Royce Gracie in action, it completely flipped upside down my whole concept of what hand-to-hand combat means, what martial arts means, what works and what doesn't work in a fight. So that was my first impression of UFC. Tell me about yours.
Okay, well, see, I'm a little bit older than you, so I was already graduated and I was in college, and guy was my best friend at the time, which we're still pretty close friends. Just went over and saw him the other day. Matter of fact, we were both in criminal justice classes at Greenville Tech, and I can't remember if we'd been talking about it prior to this, or if it was just one of those things that came up and we heard about. I can't remember that, but I just remember that Travis and I were like, "Hey, we got to watch this," and he was like, "Well, my parents have a cable box. We can rent the pay-per-view at my house." So he had this old '86 Jeep, and
What did you What did you expect it was going to be like when you first heard about it before you watched it? Do you remember?
I guess I kind of more had a pro wrestling mindset about it. I guess at the time, because
Okay.
that's what I was into.
Hmm.
You know, I'm the guy that recorded every every wrestling pay-per-view that came on. I had all kinds of and so that I guess I was thinking, tournament, martial arts, this has got to be some kind of equates to something like pro wrestling, whatever, but it's just fighting. So maybe it's kind of like boxing a little bit. So I was kind of, I guess, like a mix of boxing and
But then they were like
wrestling.
presenting it as no rules, right?
Yeah.
No
Well, and that's
rules.
that. I guess that's probably where I thought it's
Hmm.
more like pro wrestling.
Yeah.
That the big time we call it showmanship, the
Hmm.
big show, the lights, the cameras, the all this kind of stuff. I thought, okay, but it's mixing some real fighting in, maybe. So that's maybe where the
Hmm.
boxing part of it came in. So I'm like, okay, we got to check this out. So
Okay.
we went to went and got us a couple pizzas from Little Caesars. Come back to his house, rented it, and we sat there and watched the very first one. And Travis had taken some martial arts, and I had never actually taken martial arts, but I was kind of like you. I watched every
Hmm.
martial arts movie.
You already had your own concept of
Yeah,
what works and what
yeah,
doesn't work
and
in a
like
fight,
you,
right?
I was a Van Damme guy. I've never been a big Seagal fan. I always thought that Van Damme and Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris, of course, were it. And I always thought that
Mhm.
Steven Seagal was just riding their coattails. But there again, that's like I had that, and I knew
Uh,
that Chuck and what
One an unsung hero of mine of that group, Michael Jai White. I just had to throw that in there.
I
Michael
like
Jai
him.
White.
I do
I
like
like
him,
Michael Jai White. Yep.
and I guess what really makes me like him more than anything is he dislikes Steven Seagal.
Oh yeah.
Anybody that dislikes him, I guess, is okay in my book. But
And he's
anyway,
out of all of them, he's the most legit.
oh yeah, oh yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
I would not want
I
to
wouldn't
mess with
mess
him.
with him. Oh. Anyway,
But
sorry. Continue.
no, so I had that preconceived notion. I knew Chuck fought tournament karate before that, so I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, well I guess this kind of works. I knew Van Damme had fought. I think he fought point karate.
And I think he had a couple kickboxing matches under his belt.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so I was like, so this is probably what this is going to be. Just some kind of
Hmm.
tournament like that. And we started watching, and we were like, oh my god, this is just like the coolest thing we've ever seen. Like when Emmanuel Yarborough got in there with Keith Hackney,
Oh
like
yeah.
you got like
Okay.
a 300-pound
Guys,
difference.
real quick for the people listening at home who may not know. So we gotta remember that not everyone listening or watching tonight is familiar with these names. So let me just break it down. Okay. So Emmanuel Yarborough, who Robby just mentioned, he's like this. The guy must have been like 500 pounds.
I think he was closer to 6, but we'll say
600.
500.
He was like this big fat black dude who had a sumo wrestler background. Like he was an actual sumo wrestler. Keith Hackney looked like a
He was
middle-aged 180-pound country guy. He had a bit
he
of a
was just a
mullet.
police officer from I don't remember where he
Was
was
he a
from.
police officer?
Yeah, he was a police officer,
And
and he was maybe 200 pounds, maybe
I'd say a buck
180.
90.
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, he had
185.
a bit of a mullet. He looked like he
Yeah.
enjoyed listening to country music, but his background was Kenpo karate. Like he had a black tank top, but he had the karate pants. Do you remember?
Yep.
So he was there to represent Kenpo, which is uh no, that's not Chuck Norris's martial art. Chuck Norris is Tang Sudo. Never mind.
Yeah.
But he goes in there and just you can finish the rest of that story, Robby. Explain to the people at home what happened.
Well, and this is kind of what the UFC, the very first UFC, the first
Yeah, no
3,
weight classes.
the 4, there was no weight
No,
classes.
fuck weight
Really,
classes.
really no rules. I think the only rules were no eye gouging and
No biting.
no biting.
And
I don't even think
no
did they did they have the no small joint manipulation rule in at that time,
no,
or
they
did that come
didn't.
in later?
I think you were even able to pull the hair.
Well, obviously you could, because
Yeah.
Gracie was pulling
Yeah.
Chemo's hair in the second or third one. I can't remember whichever one Chemo showed up in.
Yeah.
There was hair pulling there, but I think eye gouging, biting, and maybe fish hooking. there wasn't many rules. It
There
was
weren't
pretty
many
much
rules.
no holes barred, with the exception of like you couldn't punch anybody in the balls, I guess. Which I don't know. Maybe
Oh,
there were.
well, no, actually, you could. Remember, Joe
That's true.
Son.
Yeah.
And Keith
Yep. You're
Hackney
right.
was the guy who did it.
Yep. You're right. You're right. I forgot. So throw that one out the window. You got to think this has been what 30 something years ago since the first one came out. It's
Almost 30, almost exactly 30 years ago to the day,
Yep.
almost.
Because I've been out of high school 30 years. So, I graduated in 93. So it's been a while. But anyway, and I've watched a lot of UFC since then, just about every one of them, up until probably like
Some
the
more recent ones. It's hard to keep up.
Yeah, the middle of last year, I think, is where I started, because it's just number one. There's not really anybody that I really, really pull for now. That I like a few of them, but it's not like back in the days when Chuck and Tito and Randy and BJ and all those guys that were just like, there was always somebody really good that I could pull for.
George St. Pierre. Everyone was pulling for George St. Pierre, man.
I love
George St. Pierre. He's like such a good guy.
Well, and that's what a lot of people, him and Tito, the polar opposites. Tito was the one that loved to talk crap about everybody, and George would just sit there, and no matter who was talking, okay, we'll see. But they would both get the result that they wanted to get.
Yeah.
Just doing it in two different ways.
You know what was interesting though? There was one moment where you do see George get pissed, and that was in the promo like documentaries.
Yep.
Of his first
and he apologized for it too.
No, I think it was his first fight with BJ Penn.
Yeah.
I think the producers of the show, they told him what BJ said about him, and then you could see like that's the first time you see George GSP get like legitimately like flustered. And then he comes back at him, but man, I love those days.
Yeah,
I miss those days.
There were some good matches back in the late 90s to mid 2000s. That was, in my opinion, probably the best time for the UFC. I mean, there's some good stuff now. Don't get me wrong, but as far as back then.
So the first UFCs, going back to that, I think it was different. The types of matches or the quality of matches. Because for those of you who at home who did not watch the original first few UFCs, it was like watching a car wreck a lot of the times.
That's a good analogy.
Okay. Do you remember in UFC 2, Pat Smith? Remember Pat Smith, the guy who got tapped out by Ken Shamrock in the first one, but then he comes back and then gets to the finals in UFC 2? Remember in the first round, he goes up against that ninjutsu guy?
Is that the crucifix ending?
No, that wasn't the crucifix. Pat Smith mounted his ass and he just
I remember.
Unloads with that was the first fight in UFC 2. That was the first UFC match I ever watched. Because remember, I never watched UFC 1. I heard about it from my friend. UFC 2 comes out and I'm like, I am immediately watching this. First fight I see is Pat Smith versus this guy, and he kind of like looked like Keith Hackney, where he was like an old, like a more middle-aged looking, like probably even smaller than Keith Hackney, but he had like this mustache, right? And he did have a bit of a mullet, but this dude took it a little more seriously than Keith Hackney. You could tell Keith Hackney was like just a cop who happened to do karate, right?
Yeah.
This dude. Oh man, you know what? I gotta find his name. This is where I need to find his name, because people need to look this up. Shit. When I write UFC 2, it goes into the 200s. God damn it. You fucking
like, did you mean UFC 200? No.
Yeah, did you mean UFC 295? I'm like, no, you fuck, damn it. Okay, here we go. I gotta find his name. It's so important to end. Trick Smith. Okay. All right. I think his name was Scott Morris. Anyway, sorry about that.
That sounds familiar.
But here's the thing. So this guy was like a crappier version of Steven Seagal, where he was just like this dude who thought he knew Asian culture, so he would walk around in like kimonos and shit. This is what I heard about this guy from podcasts of people who were at the event. They said this guy was like a ninjutsu guy, right? But he had like and he was like a Steven Seagal type where he thought he was like literally a ninja to the point where he would walk around with kimonos and shit, and he would have his followers. Like, those like old school, like learn ninjutsu, right? He
Yeah.
was like one of those dudes. And he went up in there with Pat Smith. And the first match I ever watched was with that guy and Pat Smith. And it was one of the bloodiest, most brutal fucking beat. This is back when you could just unload on someone in a mount. And the thing about a lot of these early matches is that a lot of them were very lopsided because it was usually it was one guy who clearly did not know what the fuck he was doing.
Yeah.
Or who had never been in a fight and was more of a theory fighter because they spent all day in the dojo. But then they get punched in the face one time and they're like, oh shit, what the hell?
What they say? It's always a good plan till you get punched in the face.
Yeah, there was a lot of that in the first couple UFCs where they hyped this guy up. Remember the very first match? Gerard Gordeau versus that sumo guy?
Yeah, I wished I could have gone back and found these and watched the first ones or watched the first one again, because the first three kind of like run together. I know all the matches. It's just hard to remember which match was in 1, 2, or 3.
The first one was where the guy's tooth flew out and into the crowd. That was the very first match.
Okay, I remember that. I just didn't.
Yeah,
like I said, it's hard to remember because it seemed like when those first 3 came out, I can't remember how far apart they were, but it just there was a lot of the same guys that fought in that one, but they fought different people because like Hackney should have been in the finals, but he broke his hand on Yarborough's head.
On Yarborough's big old head. Yeah.
Yeah. But then he came back and fought again in the second one. And then Gary Goodrich, like you said, or not, Pat Smith fought in the first one. And then came back and fought in the second one. Gary Goodrich didn't fight in the first one, but fought in the second and the third, I think. I don't think he fought in the first one. And I think it was Gary Goodrich I was talking about that did the crucifix on the guy instead of Pat Smith.
Yeah.
Where he had the guy's arm trapped and had his leg.
That was Gary Goodrich. Yeah, Gary Goodrich.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he had that European judo guy in the crucifix, and he just
that was brutal.
That was gnarly. And the thing is, the refs didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah, he even looked up at the ref like, "Are you going to stop this?" The ref's like,
"They weren't ready for some of that shit."
Yeah, he could have very easily killed that guy.
Yeah,
that guy was out after the first 2 or 3 strikes, and he hit him like probably 20 more times after that. It seems like.
So, tell me about your first impression of Hoyce, the guy who won the first 3 or the first 2. Should have won the first 3. What were your thoughts on him when you first saw him?
First time I saw him, I was like, "Who the hell is this guy?" Because there again, I didn't know anything about mixed martial arts at the time, which I don't. To be honest, I don't think we really could. We do call it that, but I don't think it was really mixed martial arts at the time.
That word didn't come on until later.
Yeah, it was.
Back then, it was just called UFC.
Yeah, it was multiple disciplines. If you were a wrestler, that was all you were. If you were a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, that's all you were. So I didn't know anything about. I mean, obviously, I knew Aikido and I knew ninjutsu and karate and kempo and taekwondo. I knew what all of them were.
Yeah.
Other than that was the first I'd ever heard of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I'd heard of Jiu-Jitsu.
First time I'd ever heard of it. Yeah.
I'd heard of Jiu-Jitsu, just never Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And so once I saw the first one, then I started looking into it. And back then you had the internet back then, but it wasn't like it is now. You get on the old dial-up modem and all that stuff, but you could still find out a little bit of stuff. So started finding out about Helion going to Japan and learning all the stuff, then bringing it back to Brazil and putting his own spin on it and things like that. And honestly, that's what the first couple of UFCs was just a big billboard for Gracie Jiu-Jitsu.
It was an infomercial.
Yeah, it was a however long infomercial about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, specifically Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. And I'd say it probably worked.
Okay, so hold on. Let's just break down real quickly, I guess, if you want to break down the history of the family, like the early history. It's pretty fascinating. I mean, that should be a podcast in its own right if you think about it.
Yeah, they're a very complex family. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. Um. So, okay. So this was basically. I'm trying to look up. So this was like early 1900s, like 1901. Um. Actually, no, like 1917. Like this was like the time of World War One, right? So there's like this Japanese fisherman, Mitsuyo Maeda, who's living in Brazil. They had a lot of immigrants going back and forth, and the reason why he's living in Brazil, he's there with his family and he's working as a fisherman, but he's only there like a few years. He's not there for like life, right? He just moved there from Japan as a judo master and a jiu-jitsu master. It's like this old school traditional jiu-jitsu. He doesn't know the language. He doesn't know how to get his way around. So he meets this guy named Gracie, right? I think it was Gustavo Gracie at the time. And who went on to basically, he was like the guy who showed him around and helped him adapt to Brazilian life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they became very close. And as repayment, recompense for being so generous to him, Mitsuyo Maeda decides to teach Gustao's sons his form of Japanese jiu-jitsu. Brazil's kind of a fucked up place. I'm sure we are all aware, where people are just like out in the streets, just scrapping all the time. So they're not just training this, they're getting into like fights on the regular. So they are literally adapting this to like being in a ghetto ass area and having to fight every day, but also going home and learning from this Japanese old wise master who has this life debt to their father. Right? Do you know what wound up happening with him? The Maeda guy? He
Mm-mm.
actually went on to move to America and became a pro wrestler.
Really?
Yeah. And this guy, one of the things that what I later found out about him was that he didn't only learn old school Japanese jiu-jitsu. He also did judo, which is pretty similar, but he was also an English catch wrestler. And he was trained as a pro wrestler.
You talking about like Frank Gotch catch wrestling
Yeah.
type stuff?
Yeah, like that Frank Gotch catch wrestling, because there was a lot of that influence at the time in Japan, and he had
Yeah.
gotten some of that, and he actually moved
Well, I think
to
that's a lot of like the Japanese strong style that you hear
yeah,
so much about now. I
yeah.
think a lot of that
That's why
is
there's so much
kind
pro
of
wrestling in
yeah,
Japan, because they had those roots in catch wrestling going on. It's been going on, right?
yeah.
So here's a little food for thought, right? That first guy that taught the Gracie's sons, he had a pro wrestling background that he was applying in his what he was teaching to his sons. Catch wrestling. That's an actual form of wrestling.
Right.
Which means there's a very good possibility this means that pro wrestling and Brazilian jiu-jitsu, if this were like a martial arts family tree, they're like distant cousins.
Learn something new every day, Donnie. I did not know that.
You know where
What
I
did he
learned all this? You know where I learned all this? Josh Barnett's podcast.
really? The
Yeah.
babyface assassin.
Because he's like a historian with catch wrestling. And he was doing a podcast with Horian Gracie's sons. And he was telling the history of Maeda, the guy who taught their grandfather. And they're like, we didn't know. They didn't realize that they were distantly related to pro wrestling. And their minds were blown. And it was fascinating, man.
That's really.
Fascinating.
I want to go back and watch this podcast now to hear this. What was his? Who did he go? Or did he have a ring name?
Well,
Or
you mean Maeda?
yeah.
No, see, this was back in like World War II, like the
So
40s and 30s. So pro wrestling was a very different thing back then.
it's
It
probably
was
like
like
the WWF or something like
it was.
that.
I don't even think there were like promotions. It was more like these
The
one-off
territory.
shows and like going to
Yeah, that
carnivals
was
and
back when it was doing territories
yeah,
or the early days of territories when, like you just said, it was
40s and 50s.
yeah, which and the WWF was kind of sort of like that, uh, but then it started going into the territory thing where like say Ric Flair for example, when he was the NWA World Heavyweight Champion,
Mm-hmm.
you had Mid South, you had Mid Atlantic, you had Georgia, you had Texas, you had Dallas, you had all these territories that had all these. You would have the Mid South
Mm-hmm.
heavyweight champion, you would have the Georgia Southern heavyweight champion, you'd have the Dallas heavyweight champion. but they were all under the NWA, the North or the
Yeah.
National Wrestling Alliance, which
Yeah.
encompassed all this. So Rick would have to go around to all these different territories and wrestle there.
But it wasn't like the NWA actually owned all those territories. It was more
No,
like an
it's just
alliance, right?
yeah, it
It
was
was like
that's why it was called the
it was
National
you know
Wrestling
what it
Alliance.
was? It was a confederation.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was.
It was
But
the
see,
confederacy of wrestling.
every one of those territories had their own booker. Like,
Yeah.
you guys like Jerry Jarrett, Jeff Jarrett's dad,
Mhm.
um, Bill Watts, Eric Watts' dad, people like that. They were in charge of booking those territories, but they still had to. They couldn't just come in and job Ric Flair out to their champion just because their guy was a champion. Sometimes they did, sometimes they did, but it just depended on what
It
they
was it
owed.
like decision by committee? Like all the
Right.
bookers would kind of like
And
hash it out and
Jim Crockett Promotions kind of was the overarching head of the table, so to speak, in that territory. So they would all have their meetings and they would figure out, and they kind of had a good idea. But if Rick had to drop a loss to one of their guys, then obviously, there was going to be something on the other
they
side
had
of
to
that.
do something for them down the
Yeah,
road or something.
yeah.
Yeah.
Hey,
Yeah.
so and so needs a push. You need to
Hey
give him a
man, that
push.
is until Vince McMahon comes along and you know what?
And
The way you described the old because that's before my time, right? Because for pro wrestling, I came up on the Saturday morning WWE, like the
yeah,
golden era, right? The Hogan, Andre. That's what I grew up on. And then later on, as like later in elementary school, I would randomly spot NWA on TV. And then of course WCW comes along, right? But so the old school territory days, like those Smoky Mountain, the Jimmy Crockett days, that's before my time because it was not available where I was at. I've always heard of them, and I've seen clips. I've seen like individual matches just for like history's sake, right?
yeah.
By the way, you ever see old school videos of Andre the Giant when he was like in his actual physical prime? Dude, he looked like a completely different person, man.
Yeah, the Andre that you and I knew as kids, he had
That was
already.
he was already
Yeah, he
yeah,
he was still amazing. Don't get me wrong,
yeah,
but he was already way. I mean, because he died in '93, so I mean, he died
yeah.
when I graduated from high school. And you were in 8th grade. I mean, so what
Mhm.
we saw growing up was like a shell of what he used to be.
Yeah, it was a shell. I mean, okay, so for people who don't know, if you ever go back and watch like old school clips, like black and white Andre the Giant, like back into like the 60s and 70s, that dude could move, man. Like he was shredded too. Like he was that dude was, and he was that big, and to see him
Mhm.
like do like he was agile and quick and athletic, and again, like all like in
Well,
shape. I was like,
yeah.
whoa, I didn't know this about Andre. I didn't know he looked like this.
And the thing is, Andre, growing up in the time he grew up, he wasn't able to take advantage of some of the medical things that we've got
No,
now. Paul
he
White would have
couldn't.
been in the
No,
same. He would have been in the same
no.
boat as Andre had he not, because he had that surgery when he
You
was a
know
kid.
what would have happened? I think if Andre had been born like later, like in more modern times, I think he would have wound up like a basketball player.
Probably.
Yeah, like
Well, I
he
mean,
looked like a basketball player back then, like when he
well, I
was
mean,
in his
think
pro
about
wrestling prime.
Big Show, Paul White. He started out in basketball. Kevin Nash started. He actually played
Yeah.
for University of Texas or
Didn't
Tennessee.
Undertaker play too?
Yeah,
And Kane. I
Hey,
think Undertaker and Kane both played basketball.
I don't know about Ken. I know Undertaker played basketball. Kevin Nash played basketball. Big Show played basketball. Um, who else? Sean Stasiak was a basketball player. Matt Morgan was a basketball player.
Yeah.
I don't know if
Oh,
I don't think any of them went pro. I think they were all college and stopped. I don't think any of them actually went pro. Now, some of them may have went semi pro or something like that.
well, yeah.
Basketball's got so many.
The only other more common former athlete in pro wrestling is former football players.
Oh yeah,
That's
there's a
probably way more. Yeah.
ton of former football players. I mean,
It's like
there's
half the
some.
roster.
Well, I mean,
Half the roster.
yeah. I mean, like Jim Duggan. Most people don't even realize because Jim Duggan's been a pro wrestler so long. Most people don't even realize he played professional football. Lex Luger played professional football, but
Like
he's
NFL level?
yeah. Luger played for the Chargers, I think. Duggan played for I want to say the Browns or the Bills. I can't remember which team he finished with. Obviously Goldberg played professional, played in the NFL.
The Rock almost did.
Rock and Austin both played collegiate ball.
College,
Ron Simmons.
Oh no! If you include all the ones who played college ball, then the field gets way wider, right?
Yeah,
Way
if you
wider.
just narrow it down to just pro,
Yeah.
I mean, you gotta look at Pat McAfee. He's actually on the WWE roster. He played pro ball, so you throw him in there. Brock Lesnar kind of did it backwards. He actually.
Do you know football history very well? Because I don't know much about football.
I'm pretty good on it.
Of all the pro wrestlers who were once NFL players, who was the best player?
The best player that was a
like who made it the furthest in professional football of all of them who became pro wrestlers? Not counting Pat McAfee because he was more of a football celebrity who gets it in WWE.
But so you want who that's a professional wrestler did the best in football, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Let me think about that. Is that all or just pro? Because Ron Simmons has got pro. So I'd say because Ron Simmons probably hands down, he didn't go pro, but he
should have.
He should have. But Florida State retired his jersey with all the accolades he had. So, but
didn't Goldberg get kind of far?
Goldberg was kind of like a mid-level. I mean, he was great. Don't get me wrong, but he was more like a he was a journeyman. I guess is the better word. He played for 3 or 4 different teams. I think he finished in Atlanta, but what finished him was he had a torn ab muscle, and he played an entire season with a torn ab. That's amazing because that would hurt to breathe if you had your ab muscle torn. But he played an entire season with a torn ab.
Pro level football.
Yeah.
Jeez.
And on the defensive side of things too. I'd say probably Kevin Green or Steve McMichael because they both had Super Bowl championships. You got Lawrence Taylor. He actually wrestled for a little bit.
He only did like 1 or 2 matches though, and
but I would say probably in my memory that had an actual extended wrestling career, Kevin Green and Steve McMichael. That's probably 2 of the top that I would say because they both have Super Bowl championships. And McMichael actually held a World Tag Team Championship with Chris Benoit. And I think Kevin Green might have maybe held a smaller title in WCW for a little bit, maybe a tag team championship, but definitely McMichael, this with a
See, I could easily answer the opposite question though. Which former NFL player who went into pro wrestling made it the biggest? I'm like, Goldberg. Answer simple, Goldberg.
Yeah. That would be my answer with that
Goldberg.
One. Yeah. Multiple world championships.
Not the biggest in wrestling, but out of all of the ones who are former NFL players, he made it the furthest in wrestling.
I would 100% agree. And then conversely, what person has done the best in all sports he's played? Brock Lesnar. Because that dude can excel at the top of the level. He didn't make the team for Minnesota, but I didn't know this. They actually
Robbie, we need to stop right here because Brock Lesnar needs to be his own episode. Let's hold off on that. Let's come back to that. Let's just do an episode where we just talk about Brock Lesnar.
Yeah,
the man, the myth, the legend.
I could definitely be down for that too.
I would vote for Brock Lesnar for president. I love that man.
Yeah,
I love that man.
He's a dude, that's for sure.
Yeah. Brock Lesnar could walk up to me and say the most racist thing about Asians, and I'd just be like, I still love you, sir.
Okay.
I still love you, sir. Okay, here's the point what I was going to make. So I wasn't there for the territory days of wrestling, but the way you describe it versus what I understand of pro wrestling history about the eventual takeover of New York territory, this whole struggle between these Southern territories versus the WWE, to me, it sounds like this weird alternate version of the Civil War.
You know, I've never heard it
because the
that
WWE
way.
is kind of like the federal government.
But
And
that's actually a really good analogy, because it's basically the way it was. It was like,
yeah.
because you had all these little Southern territories,
Mm-hmm.
like the ones I named: Mid South, Mid Atlantic, Georgia Southern, all of those, you know, and they all were their own little thing.
Yeah.
But they still kind of all operated either under the NWA banner.
Mm-hmm.
But then you had the WWF, which was everything else, and it was a big machine.
Yeah.
And you know, eventually the big machine won. But then the big machine it got beat for 93 weeks in a row by them Southern territorial, once they got kind of come together. Now,
are you talking about the Monday Night Wars?
mm-hmm.
Does that count though? WCW, does that really count as like
Oh
the
yeah, that
territories
was
coming together? Because it became its own Turner entity, and
well, it did, but Turner bought NWA, which was all those territories. So out of out of the NWA was born World Championship Wrestling. So from the National Wrestling Alliance came World Championship Wrestling. So all those wrestlers that you had seen in the territories, Sting, Ric Flair, Dusty Rhodes, you know, Rock and Roll Express, all those people were still in the WCW. They were just because they had an NWA champion, and then they had a WCW champion, and then eventually the NWA is now back to its own entity again, which there is no WCW. But see, that's
a different NWA. That's
right.
the Billy Corgan. You're talking about the Billy Corgan NWA,
right? Yeah. But it still uses that old the small
old school,
square belt, like which I love that belt. A lot of people don't like that belt.
Oh, you watch that? Cool. So you watch that Billy Corgan NWA sometimes?
I've watched it a couple times, but I've never like sat down and watched it religiously. But I actually, one of the ones besides some of the big ones that I actually like Ricky Morton's School of Morton, because that reminds me so much of the old NWA, the stuff that I used to watch on Saturdays and Sundays. And you know, like I said, I've met Ricky before. I've had long talks with him before. Ricky is so intent on passing on what he knows, and the way things were passed on to him, the way he learned things. And you to see these guys do this kind of stuff, like it's to me, it's a nostalgic type thing, I guess, more than anything, because wrestling, and it's a show. I understand. I get it.
You don't like modern wrestling, though.
I don't dislike it, but I like the way it was from when I grew up. I like the way. It's not so much it's the way things were sold was different back then.
Yeah.
They protected kayfabe back then. Now it's just kind of like, well, you don't know what's a shoot and what's a work. And yeah, for people who don't know, shoot is something that's real. Work is something that's been talked about and they know what's going on. So you don't know what's a shoot. Back then, you knew if it was a shoot or you knew it was a work, because there was just some Roddy Piper went off script several times on people, and you knew it was a shoot because you just knew.
So for people listening at home, so when people say, "Oh, pro wrestling is fake," right? What they're referring to is a work. A work is the stuff that's scripted and planned and supposed to happen. A shoot is when, in the middle of a pro wrestling match, the guy actually walks up to him and actually clocks him because he's actually pissed at him. That's called a shoot.
That's like to put it in nowadays terms, when CM Punk come out there and cross-legged on last time he was on WWE and sat there with the microphone and said all his stuff, that was a shoot. That was not scripted. That's why they ended up cutting the microphone off on him. So
I thought that was a worked shoot.
Some of it may have been, but I've heard Paul Heyman talk about it. And Paul said about 93.5% of that was shoot.
Damn.
Because you think about it, he wasn't there much longer after that.
Yeah, that's true.
and he
Okay, so
went into the UFC not long after there.
let me ask you the question, because we do have to bring it back to old school MMA. Man, we got so sidetracked on pro wrestling. We are going to do the pro wrestling with Randy. That's why I want to kind of save some of this talk, because actually, no, wait, real quick. You know what promotion I really liked that I feel like not enough people talk about? Lucha Underground.
I've watched a couple of those episodes. It's interesting.
I like Lucha Underground.
It's a totally different type of wrestling, and you have to really, really enjoy wrestling and the science of wrestling and how wrestling is presented. You have to be a student of wrestling to really appreciate that. If you're just a casual wrestling fan, just somebody who watches just because you like the high flying moves that so and so does, you're not going to get Lucha Underground, and you're not going to appreciate it. You have to really,
even the way they shot some of the promos was real interesting.
yeah, but that goes into the science of how they, and I think Conan's got a lot to do with that one too. Which I've actually had a couple of discussions with him too, and he has got such a sharp mind for wrestling. I mean, people don't think he does, but Conan is extremely intelligent when it comes to how you present a match. Oh yeah, how it has, people who Cody Rhodes, one of my favorites.
I love Cody Rhodes.
Cody and Dustin are two of the best storytellers in the ring, and they got that from their dad.
You know that first match they had where Cody and Dustin, that pay-per-view match they had for AEW the first time? Dude, I cried.
Oh, man, that's top.
I cried. I straight up cried.
Top 5 best matches I've ever seen in my life. But it's because they are such good storytellers. They learn from one of the best. I mean, Dusty was one of the. I mean, look at Dusty. You did not look at Dusty Rhodes and think, okay, that's a pro athlete. You look at that and think,
do you know what's another reason why I like Cody Rhodes? He's a paranormal guy.
Is he?
He's really into the paranormal. Apparently, I've heard they talk about podcasts, and they bring it up in what's that show they do? What was that show they did? Being the Elite.
Yeah, that's when he was back in AEW.
Yeah, so they did the early days of Being the Elite. They would even reference the fact that Cody's like all about, because the Young Bucks are very Christian in real life, right? And Cody's very much into the paranormal topics, because he's got a fascinating, apparently, and this comes from one of my friends who happens to be an indie wrestler. A lot of these pro wrestlers are like cryptid paranormal fans.
Well, I just watched a video. I sent it to Krista and Brandy the other night. Shotzi and Victoria do. I don't know if it's like something they do all the time, but they went to this prison in St. Augustine. It's about one of the most haunted prisons in the U.S. And they took Rhea Ripley and Dominic Mysterio with them. Look it up on YouTube. It was hilarious to see Rhea and Dom's reactions.
Like pro wrestlers. Were they did they seem like actually scared too? I bet you.
Oh, they did. Yeah. There was one spot where something touched Rhea, and she was like, she was like literally actually hugging on Dominic's arm.
Dude, did you see that? I don't know which show it was, but there was this one paranormal investigation show where they had Roddy Piper on, where they were actually investigating his house and they were interviewing him.
I don't think I saw that one.
Dude, look this up, okay? So it's like a psychic investigation show where these people ask them to come because they're having paranormal situations happening. For this episode, it was Roddy Piper. And this medium goes and she does a walkthrough and she has no fucking clue who Roddy Piper is, right? And she does, she's getting all the messages, receiving everything, right? And then she's describing the spirit to Roddy and describing its history and the way it knows him. And then she's saying like its name. It was Owen Hart. And when you see the look on Roddy's face when he realizes it was Owen Hart, dude, man, you got to watch that.
I'm going to have to look that up. That sounds cool.
I was like, what the? Apparently, did you know Roddy Piper had a podcast before he died? I used to listen to a lot of podcasts when podcasts first came out, because I used to listen to like the very first Joe Rogan episodes. And during those early days of podcasting, Roddy Piper had a podcast, and on it, he would talk about, wrestling stories, But you could tell that's not what he really wanted to talk about. What he really wanted to talk about was the paranormal and conspiracy theories. That's all he wanted to talk about. Bigfoot stories, ghost stories, and conspiracy theories.
Hmm.
He was like one of us, man.
That's cool. I
That's
did
kind of
not know that.
awesome. That's why, like, man, I was so sad when he, you know.
And even though he was predominantly through most of my childhood, Piper was a bad guy. He was a heel through. I mean, because
Dude, I loved the shit out of him.
but I still he was always one of my favorites.
He was my favorite, man. Okay, so other than Hoist, who is your favorite old school MMA fighter?
Back then, Don Fry.
He was a character. I grew to love him later on.
I liked Dan Severn, but he was not on it a whole lot or enough, because Dan was already getting kind of up there.
Mm-hmm.
But then when Dan brings in this young buck that kind of looks like him, kind of acts like him.
Okay.
Then,
speaking of Dan Severn, do you remember the first match he ever had? He was up against this young whippersnapper kung fu dude. And then Dan Severn just does like a suplex city on him.
Yeah.
He literally does suplex city on this dude.
Yeah, before Brock
he just does German after German. And you're like, holy shit, this is an actual person doing an actual German on a dude in an actual
Dan
fight.
Severn was a
and
beast.
He's doing several of them. That shit was fucked up. I was like, whoa, people look that up. Dan Severn's first fight in the UFC, he annihilated this dude.
Yep. And, yes, he got tapped out, but that fight could have easily gone another way.
Oh, you mean, are you talking about to Hoist?
Yeah.
You know what it was? He had no idea how to fight against a gi.
Yeah.
And how to defend against a triangle choke where a guy's on the bottom. He had no clue what submissions from the bottom was.
But if you look at how Severn did in those early matches, that kind of showed you what wrestling brought to the table.
He was the first guy who showed,
yeah,
okay, you want to see what wrestling does now? Like wrestling, and you're like, holy shit.
Now look at all the top level guys, all the best of the best. How many of them were wrestlers first?
For a good while, most of the MMA fighters were coming from wrestling backgrounds. Not as much lately.
Well, now it's just, I mean, you might wrestle
nowadays. Lately, they start as MMA fighters.
Yeah,
that's what I feel like. Yeah,
but wrestling is incorporated into that now.
Yeah,
wrestling
unless you're in some, unless you're from some bumblefuck ass country like Dagestan and your name is Khabib, who like started wrestling bears when he was like 8 years old and shit. Unless you're like a freak of a human like that.
And really, Dan was the first, Dan Severn, and then
he was the first one who showed the power of wrestling in a fight.
But the first one that really took it mainstream and made people look and say, God, wrestling, was Matt Hughes. Because Matt Hughes was the first high level wrestler that really, look, obviously Matt Hughes came along once they kind of.
I have to disagree. No,
I'm talking about once they're on a bigger stage when it wasn't underground anymore.
You overlooked somebody.
Well, I know Mark Coleman.
And you got it, Mark Coleman. Yeah. Mark Kerr, actually, Mark Kerr.
Well, both of them, Coleman and Kerr,
both of them,
because they were best friends, I think, right?
No, you know why they were important? I'll tell you why. Because with Mark Coleman and Mark Kerr, not only do you get the top of the food chain in terms of just wrestling, like Olympic. For people who don't know, Mark Coleman beat Kurt Angle, the Olympic gold medalist, and he was supposed to go, and he could have won the gold medal. Mark Kerr was on that level too.
Yeah.
And to see that level of wrestler, but then also that delicious amount of steroids as well, all together, you're like, oh, so that's what that looks like.
Mm-hmm.
It's just something to behold.
But you're right. But what I meant was, from that, because Coleman and Kerr were both in that, more in that early stage,
and they were so juiced.
Yeah, they were
so juiced.
But Hughes was in that once it came out of the underground, and it was still in its infancy of being an actually recognized sport. That's what I'm talking about with that heat, because most people when they that know Mark Coleman and Mark Kerr probably know him from Pride.
Yeah,
because that's where they really made their names. And I know you said that's another show for another day. You want to do the
that's
Pride
another
show,
show for another day. But
but a lot of people don't even remember Mark Kerr from UFC.
so most
Most,
people remember him from Smashing Machine, that
yeah,
documentary.
yeah,
Yeah,
but most of that stuff was when he was in Pride.
yeah.
I mean, and granted, Mark Coleman had a longer UFC career than Mark Kerr did,
Hmm.
but still, a lot of people don't remember. You know, and Randleman the same way. A lot of people don't remember a lot of his
Oh, that
UFC
was
stuff.
another one. That was another one. Kevin
Yeah,
Randleman. Yes,
yeah,
he was
the
another one
monster.
on that level.
But hey, that was Mark Coleman's protege, and but a lot of people remember him specifically from Pride. I mean, it's kind of like the reverse of what Quentin Jackson was. Quentin started in Pride and then came to UFC towards the end of his
Yeah,
career,
yeah.
but they started in UFC, but UFC was in its infancy and
Hmm.
it hadn't gone mainstream yet. It was still underground, and
Yeah.
you could still only see it on through the video store or pay-per-view or something like that, but you didn't hear, it wasn't advertised like it is now.
Hmm.
As to where when Matt Hughes first came on the scene, that was when it was,
How
Dana
far did
White
he
and
get
all
in
them.
wrestling? Was he like an NCAA guy?
Yeah, he was NCAA, and I want to say he was.
I think he was NCAA champ, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think him and his brother both were, but I think his brother was a weight
That's
class
another
below
pretty
him.
prestigious title, being NCAA champ.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Not quite Olympic gold medalist, but if you're fighting someone who's an NCAA champ,
well,
oh man, that's
like
gonna be a tough day.
going back to that. That's not that. That's as far as Brock went in wrestling. Now Brock could
Yeah.
have gone further if he wanted to, and I think Matt Hughes the same way could have gone further if he wanted to, but they both just had other things in their cards.
Possibly, yeah.
I think Matt Hughes probably, and Kurt Angle was even talking about who was it? Shelton Benjamin. Because Shelton was Brock's roommate.
Yeah.
Shelton was the one who had to wrestle Brock when he first came to the University of Minnesota
Hmm.
from that JUCO that he was at.
Shelton
But
was like his coach, wasn't he?
yeah,
Yeah.
and then Shelton actually got into WWE before Brock. So Shelton's actually been one of the ones that's kind of paved the way just about everywhere Brock's been as far as pro wrestling goes.
Yeah.
But Kurt Angle said Shelton Benjamin is one of the most overlooked
He
and
is. He
underrated
really
wrestlers,
is. He
amateur
really
wrestlers
is.
there is. I mean, I don't think he won any national accolades, but it wasn't because he wasn't good.
He's a good wrestler, man, and he is an often overlooked, and people get pissed off at like the way he gets booked in the WWE.
Well, not
They're
no
always
more.
like, dude.
He was in this latest little round of releases that Vince did.
Oh man, who got released recently?
Well, big names: Shelton Benjamin, Dolph
Damn.
Ziggler.
Dolph Ziggler? No, I love that
Yep,
dude.
yep. Uh, Rick Bogues, Elias.
Oh man, they got rid of Elias.
Yep,
God damn it!
and
You couldn't find something for Elias.
Madcap Moss. Those are the big names that they got rid of.
Oh, Dolph
Uh,
Ziggler.
yeah, and then of course AEW got rid of CM Punk.
Yeah, but he had to go.
Yeah,
He had to go.
that was kind of, you saw the writing on the wall, saw that coming.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew that was coming when he got in a fight with Matt and or not Matt, but what's the Young Bucks names?
Mac and Nick.
Matt and
No,
Nick.
Matt and Nick. Yeah.
Yeah, I started saying Matt and Jeff, and I was like, no, that's the Hardys, but it is, it's Matt and Nick, not.
Mm.
But and then there again, it's a business. I get that,
Yeah.
but from Tony Khan's standpoint, I do understand you. You're trying to compete with the WWE,
Mhm.
and it's hard enough to do that,
Yeah.
much less do that and deal with your supposed top star being acting the way he's acting.
Mm. Yeah, you can't have someone fighting people
Yeah,
like that and causing beef on publicly. I mean, he
yeah,
did it publicly, man. That's not
exactly.
excusable. Yeah.
And
Anyway, real quick, I had a question in mind I wanted to ask you. Shit, I'm drawing a blank now. Damn it. Okay, wait, hold on. Going back to the MMA thing, okay? one of the things that I've come to realize that is if I were to like if I had like a daughter or if some woman came up to me and asked me like my recommendation as for like the best self-defense martial art a woman would want to learn, because I've had this conversation with quite a few female friends who will like go take like karate classes to make them feel safer when they're when they're out and about, as self-defense, right? So if
Mm-hmm.
I could give my recommendation for women out there, the best martial art probably for self-defense would be Brazilian jiu-jitsu. It
I would
really would.
say I would say either Brazilian jiu-jitsu or judo. I mean,
Yeah, jiu-jitsu, because
well, and the only reason I say judo is just because it's so specific on you know body position and leverage, and it's just actually I would say both because
yeah.
if somebody comes up and grabs you, you're going to be on your feet. That's where the
A-
judo would come in. But then if
And
somebody grabs
also,
you and gets you on the ground, then that's where the BJJ would come in. So
here's
I would
yeah,
say both of those would be a very good combination.
and a lot of times when the one of the reasons why Hoist was so successful in the beginning really was because one, nobody knew what the fuck this was. When they
Mm-hmm.
got into a mount, nobody knew what the hell to do, right? When they got mounted, people would like stick their arms out. Everyone knows you don't do that because you're just going to get armbarred,
Well,
right?
everybody knows that now. They didn't know it
Yeah.
then.
Yeah, but some guys would just stick their arms out and they would try to punch back. It was like you can't get any leverage. There's no point. You just block or you just try to remove, people would not know what the hell to do, right? So number
Yep.
one, nobody knew what the hell they were doing. Number two, also very important, often overlooked, Hoist has got a gi on. And a lot of his victories were him taking his jacket and his grabbing his sleeve and just wrapping it around the guy's neck. That's one of the reasons why I think it's so great for women, because usually when women they have to like get involved in this, there's going to be people with like things you can grab and you can do things with people's collars and stuff, right? That's
Yep.
what judo teaches. That's what Brazilian jiu-jitsu is all about. I think the reason why Hoist didn't have a better career afterwards was because he lost the gi. Most of his wins, especially over the bigger guys, he always used the gi.
Mm-hmm.
He used the gi on Dan Severn.
Yep.
He used his gi against Ken Shamrock.
Yeah. He did.
He used his gi and pulled the hair of Chemo. When the going got dirty, he was like, "Okay, I'm not going to win, so I got to start using this thing that I'm wearing as a weapon." Meanwhile, the other guy's like shirtless. That thing is a weapon. I actually studied Brazilian jiu-jitsu for a short while, like a few months. And yeah, a lot of it is that gi is there for a reason.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It's definitely an offensive weapon,
It is.
and
And defensive.
yeah. I mean, look, there's not much difference. I don't think. I mean, I know Gracie's older, but he's not much older than Matt Hughes, and he was still in fairly good shape when him and Matt Hughes fought. But the playing
Man,
field was even
no.
as
Matt
far
Hughes
as
was gonna. I
oh
knew
yeah,
it was gonna happen like that. I
yeah.
knew so.
But you saw it in Gracie's eyes. He didn't want that fight.
No. The first time they announced it, I was like, "What are you doing? Don't do this fight, please." I knew what was gonna happen.
But that's kind of it kind of had to happen though, because at that time Gracie was the torchbearer for the old school underground
Mhm.
UFC. Matt Hughes was kind of the face of the new. I mean, obviously he had kind of gone on a little bit too, but that was kind of like that. Okay, we're graduating from the old school stuff to the new school stuff.
Mhm.
So that, and I'm not saying that fight was fixed, but everybody, like you just said, everybody knew what was going to happen.
You know what?
Gracie could have won that fight as far as had he had his gi, he could have caught Matt Hughes very easily in a choke.
The gi is completely different. It's a
But
completely different thing.
when he had to fight with everything being equal as far as the rules go, that's where at
Yeah.
that time that's where it went out went
Plus,
off.
he's a little bit older, and also Matt Hughes is not a guy who doesn't know what the fuck he's doing, right? If he's in a mount or if
Exactly.
he's in the guard, he knows what to do, right?
Yep. And I think that's why I think it was to show that though. Just like the first couple of UFCs were specifically to show a purpose. I think that match right there was to specifically show a purpose that yes, this was the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu was the way at one time, but now mixed martial arts is the way.
Yeah.
But there you can argue and say Matt Hughes has had that happen to him now too. I mean, before the wreck, obviously. I'm not talking about that. Before the bad wreck, he kind of had to pass the torch to GSP and some people like that had kind of transitioned past what he was into the true hybrid fighters that we're seeing now. They're just like you said, that just start out in mixed martial
I
arts
mean,
and start learning everything.
that the first true hybrid fighters were that generation, the BJ Penn, Matt Hughes, and GSP generation. That's when you first started seeing the truest of the hybrid fighters, right? I mean, there were some people. I mean, there were obviously people going for that before that, but I think that generation of BJ Penn, GSP, and Matt Hughes was when you finally saw the perfect balance of everything.
Okay, I got a question for you then.
Okay.
Prime Matt Hughes versus prime Conor McGregor.
I was about to say that. I was about to ask you that. I was
See?
thinking, like, what if Prime Connor went up
Great
against
minds
Prime
think
Matt
alike.
Hughes? Yes. I don't know. Because Matt Hughes does have a tendency to get tagged. He did have a tendency to sometimes get tagged. So there's that. There's always that chance. And Connor does have hands enough to. He's got like welterweight KO hands, right? He can knock out a welterweight. So he can. I mean, yeah. I mean, the same thing you said about Khabib, right? Like Khabib is this fucking wrestling monster, but everyone always says, "Well, Connor can tag him," like he tagged Jose Aldo, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, Matt
But,
Hughes
and
can
but
be tagged.
but Jose Aldo had a chin until Connor checked
Yeah,
him out with it. So I mean, I
I could
any
see,
given Sunday,
Connor picking him apart on defeat. Honestly,
I agree with that. But if Hughes catches a hold of him, it's a different story. Because I don't think Connor has ever gotten a hold of somebody that's as strong as prime Matt Hughes was.
Khabib.
I don't know that Khabib's as strong as Matt Hughes was in Matt Hughes prime.
I don't know. See, that's a fight I'd rather see.
Well, yeah,
Prime Khabib
I
versus
just
prime Matt Hughes.
and I'm not
That'd
saying
be more
Khabib's
interesting.
not strong. I don't believe he is as because Brock Lesnar even talked about how strong Matt Hughes was because they used to mess around with each other. And
Dude,
Brock, as big as he is,
Daniel Cormier and Kane both talk about how stupidly strong Khabib is, and I'm pretty sure they
and
would have it.
I agree that he is,
Yeah,
but neither one of them had been in the ring with prime Matt Hughes though.
yeah. That's
And
like I think that's the fight I would have. You know what I would have more rather have seen? Prime Connor versus Prime GSP.
that would be a good fight too. But as much as I like Connor, I like George St. Pierre better, and I think GSP takes that fight. Prime GSP.
I think GSP would out strategize. No, you know what? I think I know what GSP would do. GSP, he can win, but sometimes he can play real cheap. He could play real cheap, right?
A lot
Like
of the
there are
jabs on
times
Josh.
where he just like what was it, Josh Koscheck, where
Josh
he just kept
Koscheck when he
taking him
just sat there
down?
and jabbed him the entire
Yeah,
match.
yeah.
But he snapped his head back the entire match. I mean, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yeah.
And Koscheck gonna stand out there out of range or in that range and let him snap off that jab 350 times. I mean,
But then he would double leg him. Yeah.
yep.
I mean, what do what works, right? Do what works. That would be interesting. I think Connor and Prime BJ would be real interesting.
Yeah. Or prime Connor and prime Vitor.
No, Vitor juiced up though. Nah, he'd be too juiced up.
But that's too strike. Well, look at Connor now.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I mean, if Connor's not juiced right now, there's something wrong because that
Vitor was juiced up most of his career though.
Yeah. Well, So was Vanderlei. I mean,
Yeah.
Vanderlei and Pride.
But you know what? Here's the thing. People judge that. I appreciated it. I wanted it. I want a league where it's just like, who cares? Who cares about doping? Just pedal to the metal. Let's see how
Dude,
far this can go.
I think it is so. I think the fact that we spent money on a congressional hearing to find out, and freaking you know who I don't want to say anything because I don't want to get the show shut down, but you know who was one of the ones who was in charge of that. You know, he lives
Yeah,
at a certain famous address on
I know.
Pennsylvania Avenue right now. But I could care less if Roger Clemens and Mark McGuire and Sammy Sosa. I could care less if they use steroids.
I
They're
don't care. And
professional athletes.
as a matter of fact, I want them to do more
Yeah,
steroids.
but here's the thing: if they don't want to do it, fine. They don't have to. But to compete at that, here's the thing: we're paying them billions of dollars a year to be show offs, basically, to compete as professional athletes.
I just, you know what it is for me? I am personally very curious to see how far science can take our bodies. I want to see the most jacked up dude, and I want to see what he can do. I want to see what our medicine can do.
I mean,
I want to see it. I'm curious. And
and
people are
there
like,
is.
ethics and morals. Fuck your ethics and
Well,
morals. These
here's
people
the thing:
are here by
nobody
choice.
and everybody loves
Yeah.
to throw Lyle Alzado out there. Lyle Alzado was making his own shit in his basement. He was not taking pharmaceutical grade steroids. He was making steroids. Okay, but there is never, ever, ever, ever been a documented case where steroids has been the reason that somebody died. Ever. So, it's one of those things. If a grown
Yeah.
person who is a professional athlete who is paid to pursue,
They both agree, right?
yeah,
They agree. My opponent's going to do steroids. I do steroids. We both have this understanding. Hey, let's even trade steroids. We both have this understanding. We're here by choice. We understand what it does to our body. Let's just see how
yeah,
far this takes us. Why does the government have to be our nanny on this? Why?
they don't have to be. They feel like they need to be, and that's the thing. If person A and person B, like you just said, both agree to it, if they want to have, okay, this league right here, well, just look at bodybuilding. You got the why
Yeah.
would you have the all natural, the Mr. Natural or whatever it's called?
It's like getting a boob job. Imagine if one person gets a boob job, another person gets a boob job, and they get into a contest to see who's got the best boob job. It's the same idea.
Yeah.
Why should that be any more or less illegal?
Because like you said, the government's got to stick their nose in it and they got to get
They
involved and
got
they
to
got to,
stick their noses in it. That's why.
yeah.
They got to play the morally upright like what is it? Seeking valor, making everyone think, "Oh, we're so moral. We care about the moral fabric of our sports
Meanwhile,
heroes."
they're probably
Yeah.
doing worse to
Yeah.
veterans.
Yeah, meanwhile, they're like in their hotel rooms getting rim jobs from Russian hookers, you know?
Yeah. But, and I've heard Rampage talk about it. He said when they'd have their fighter meetings in Pride, he said the first one he ever went to, he's like, the guy was like, we don't test for anabolic steroids here. And he said he'd never heard, which I don't know that I believe this part of
Mm.
it, but he was like, I'd never heard of anabolic steroids. I looked at my coach and said, what are anabolic steroids? And he said, and everybody was laughing at him. He said, what was funny about it, everybody always accused him of using them at that point, and he didn't even know what they were at that point. And I'm like, well, whatever. He said, but he said that he was like, they were just like, we don't care. You just
Well, did you hear about Eddie Bravo's story? Eddie
maybe.
Bravo on the Joe Rogan podcast, he said he was he was actually about to fight in Pride, and in his first meeting with the Pride people, they said they gave him the opponent, and the opponent was like 200 pounds. Eddie's like $170, and Eddie's like, I can't fight this guy. This guy's like 200 pounds, and the promoters were like, oh, do you need steroids? I can get you steroids.
Okay, sure, give me that. Huh.
And he was actually thinking about it for a second. But yeah, that's how Pride rolled back then. And yeah, And you know what? Why not? What's wrong with that? What's wrong with it?
There isn't anything. I mean,
If all parties agree and they understand what it could potentially do with their bodies and they choose to do it anyway, then that should be their choice and that should be our right to enjoy that.
well, look at smoking. Smoking is way worse for you than steroids.
Yeah.
I don't see the government stepping in and banning that. Wonder why? Because they make billions of dollars off taxes off cigarettes a year.
Yeah. Exactly.
That's
Absolutely.
It's all about this. That's what it boils down to.
Yeah, man. Remember when John McCain was trying to shut down the UFC? Remember that whole ordeal?
Yep.
Some of the bullshit he would say.
What do
Like,
you call it?
fuck
Underground cockfight or something like that, or human
yeah.
cockfight?
And I was like, John McCain, I thought you were cool, but now I'm voting for Obama, you son of a bitch. That's what I said to him. That's what I said. That's how I responded to that. I was like, fuck your Sarah Palin, fuck your election. You try to shut down UFC with some bullshit. I don't even care what Obama says. I don't even care if Obama gives a speech where he talks about we have to kill puppies. I'm voting for that motherfucker. Because you, John McCain, had to say some bullshit about my UFC. So
I think I
fuck
just
you.
wrote somebody in.
Yeah.
So
It didn't matter anything about Obama's platform because John McCain did that. I literally voted the opposite.
yeah, but that's how it goes sometimes. I mean, it's just those little things like that
That was some horse shit he was saying.
piss people off.
Yeah, man. Anyway, we've been going on for like an hour and a half. Did you want to do any final words or thoughts before we take it home tonight?
I mean, I really enjoyed this. This
Oh,
was cool.
we're doing part 2. No, actually, my idea. Let's do this again, but let's just do Brock Lesnar, the man, the myth, the legend. Let's see how long of a conversation we could hold for just Brock Lesnar.
I will take that challenge. If you take, let's see, what's a good one? Sting. Can you do we do an episode on Sting? You think you
I
can?
got to research. I'm going to have to go back and research some of his matches because I actually haven't seen a whole lot of Sting matches. The only Sting matches I ever got to watch were the ones during the Monday Night Wars.
Well, how about this?
A little bit, 1 or 2 of NWA stuff, 1 or 2, maybe like.
How about this? Let's not do just Sting. Let's do a Brock Lesnar episode. I'll get it in a minute, and then let's do just old school NWA. Back in the day, the Horsemen and Road Warriors and all that kind of stuff.
Let's get a little bit more specific. How about we do? Okay, scratch Brock Lesnar. I think this would be an even more fascinating idea of a topic. Let's do one on Ric Flair. Just Ric Flair, from beginning to end. His life, his story, his family afterwards, the man, the myth. Let's just do one on Ric Flair.
Yeah, I got a couple personal stories about Rick that I can.
I got a couple stories, and I got a story I can't tell you on air. And with that,
I'm thinking probably one of mine I probably shouldn't tell on air either. So
yeah, okay. With that, folks, we are heading out, and we're gonna now tell each other the interesting stories, and you're left out, bitches. Bye.